Hello, welcome to Lecture 12 in Communication 1110. This is a continuation of what we've looked at in Lectures 10 and 11 about understanding your audience. And in this one, we're going to particularly look at how audiences perceive and receive a message and how that affects them as they do that. It's a little bit different than reading or what you might think. Okay. Before I get into this, though, I want you to be sure to access the PowerPoint that goes with it, because there are pictures on the PowerPoint that will help you, that I'll be referring to, and will help you to understand. The first thing is, what is perception? Well, perception, and this is a pretty standard psychology book definition, is how we organize and interpret patterns of stimuli around us. Okay, now there are three key words there: pattern, organize, and interpret. Because as we develop and live in this world, we see patterns over and over again, and we learn how to interpret and organize those, and that is our perception. Without the patterns, we would have to learn everything every day, which would be pretty hard to do. What influences perception? I'm going to give you 5 areas, and this is where the pictures from the PowerPoint come in. The first influence on perception is, of course, the patterns that we have learned all through our lives. And these can be anything from the shapes we learn when we're very young, to the fact that the face has a certain look to it, and we sometimes see faces and things where there are no faces. I'm sure you've heard of stories like that. So patterns we have learned over the years. There's a slide in the PowerPoint that shows a figure, and when I show that in class, I say, all right, what is this? And people will automatically say triangle, but then they'll think and say, no, it's not, it's just 3 lines. And if you look at it, you'll see why. You learn the pattern triangle very early, so you just sort of see it, even though there really are no angles on that figure. And this is the point, that patterns determine what we see and hear, and also what we don't see and hear. And sometimes we miss things because of the patterns we are used to. You also learned another pattern in school, that teachers ask dumb questions. So when you saw the triangle, you probably thought, well, she wouldn't ask us such a dumb question. What is a triangle? So it caused you to step back a little bit. Learning more patterns is really what education is about, and sometimes not to look at the patterns is important too. The second thing that influences perceptions is context. And at this point, there's a particular picture, you may have seen this in, somewhere else or in a psychology book, of a, well, young woman or old woman. You look at it till you can see both. And that's the point. You're supposed to be able to see both the young woman and the old woman in this picture. And the point of that, it's used for a lot of reasons, but if we had been talking about the elderly, the research shows that people would see, because of the context of the conversation, would see the old woman and not the young woman. However, most of you are young, so I found there's a tendency for people to see the young woman in the picture. The third is grouping. And grouping could be how things are organized, and that's very important for speech, because one of the things you're going to have to do is organize your thoughts in a way that's most accessible and communicates the best way to your audience. So in the picture I have on the slide, you can either look at that as 9 lines, but most people would look at it and would say that that's 3 groups of lines because of the way that it's organized. The fourth thing that influences perception is expectation. If I had said at the beginning of the lecture, and this were a class, I'm going to say the word Washington, D.C. sometime in the lecture. And if you pop up first, I'll give you $50. Okay, you would expect something, and you would be more perceptive of that. You would be listening for it. So expectation is important. The picture that goes with this on the slide is the FedEx logo, where most people have seen this, and you know the letters of the English alphabet, so the FedEx is what you see. But most people miss that there's an icon of an arrow in it. So you can look for that. And you've seen that a bunch of times, but you've never seen the arrow. FedEx operates in countries where they don't use the English letters. They use Arabic or Chinese, a script or something. So what would stand out to those folks is the arrow, and FedEx wants to be fast like an arrow. So the icon's an important part of the logo, but most people miss it for that reason. So all these things influence perception. And that brings us to the next question then. How does an audience uniquely perceive a message? When they're sitting there, what is going through their brain? How are they processing this? Well, first of all, they process it in a linear time fashion. You know that when you're reading, if you don't understand something, you can go back and read it 5 times and reflect on it as many times as you need to till you understand it. In a speech, it's different. You only get one time to hear it, unless the speaker uses some of that planned redundancy we've talked about and repeats himself or herself. But of course, you don't want to do that too much. What this means then is that you cannot get as deep and you cannot cover as much material in a speech. And what I like to say is that a speech isn't just about giving a lot of content, it's about making less content, but making it more meaningful for people. So think about that. You can't cover as much as you would in, say, a written document and get it in as much detail, but you can make it meaningful for people. So it's linear in time. They only hear it once unless the speaker chooses to repeat it and emphasize it. Secondly, it's limited by the learning style, and in the class we do a learning styles inventory, and I ask you to reflect on how that learning style affects your public speaking and other people who are not your same learning style. And that's one thing we tend to do, is if we're visual, we tend to speak to the visual people and not to the others. So you need to think about that. But whether you're kinesthetic, whether you're a visual learner or an auditory learner, affects how you perceive a public speech. Then, of course, it's influenced by external and internal noise, which we've discussed earlier. External could be the sounds that are the temperature of the room, etc., and the internal noise could be what's going on inside of someone, psychologically or physically. While those are 3 limitations, when an audience is listening to a message, they can also be helped by visual cues, such as PowerPoint. They can be helped by repetition, and they can be helped by very clear structure that is emphasized for them. So what I'm asking you to do in a speech is not just have a structure, but to explain your structure as well. And of course, the way the audience perceives the message is influenced by their egocentrism, what we refer to as the what's in it for me quality, and they are influenced by their ethnocentrism, the culture that they grow up in. And obviously that's going to have a lot to do with how they perceive something and what it's said. So that brings us to the second main point on this lecture guide, and that is moving on to attention. The first thing I want to do is define attention, and this is a very important definition. It is the process of focusing on one, emphasis, one stimuli while ignoring or suppressing reactions to all the competing stimuli. And what you have to realize is that wherever you are, whatever setting, whether you're driving, sitting, talking to friends, sitting in class, thousands of things are attacking you, attacking your senses possibly. There's all kinds of things, but you aren't always conscious of those. You are paying attention to certain ones. Why? Well, let's get into that. The first reason that we pay attention is because we just choose to. We grit our teeth and we say, I need to pay attention to this class in order to get a good grade on the test. This is difficult material. So as adults, we just grit our teeth and we do it. And that's fine for you, but as a public speaker, you should not have that attitude toward the audience. As a public speaker, you should try to meet your audience halfway and make it easy for them to listen and pay attention to the speech. So that's the first reason. It's called voluntary attention. We pay attention because we just make ourselves to, we choose to. The second reason we pay attention to certain things and leave the others out is past training and experience. Sometimes someone who is very knowledgeable about a field will be watching a TV show and they'll notice that they're getting it wrong on the TV show, and because they know better, whereas someone who doesn't would just take it as part of the story and just accept it and go on with it. I had a sister-in-law who was an oncology nurse, and I asked her if she ever watched ER, and she said no, because she did watch it one time and they got it something wrong, and that bothered her and she didn't want to watch it anymore, whereas the rest of us would not notice it. Third reason that we pay attention is because of intense and salient needs. I've used that word before. If you're very hungry, commercials about food will be more apparent to you. You will notice those more. The third is expectations, as I mentioned before. If you know that you're supposed to look for something and you're expecting it, you will pay attention for it. And that's why when you read a textbook, you should read the objectives and some of those helps that they give, because it will aid you in finding the most important material in the textbook. And the last reason that we pay attention doesn't have so much to do with us. Those four have to do with what's inside of us. But the last one has to do with the object to which we're paying attention. It has to do with certain characteristics. And I'm going to get into those in a minute, but I do want to say a couple things about attention. You might say, well, what's the difference between perception and attention? Perception tends to be more universal, that everybody in a culture more or less perceives things the same, whereas attention is very individual. I'm going to pay attention to things differently than someone else is. Different things are going to grab me than someone else. And you've probably had that experience going to a movie and you notice things that someone else didn't, and vice versa. Another thing about attention is, and a lot of people disagree with me, will disagree with me, but I'm sorry, I'm right about this, is that you can only pay attention to one thing at a time. That goes back to the definition, focusing on one stimulus while ignoring or suppressing reactions to others. I know that nowadays everybody thinks they can multitask and pay attention to 5 things at once. Can't do it. No. Now what we are very good at is going back and forth. But when you go back and forth between several things paying attention, it hurts that going into your short-term and then your long-term memory. So the point is, if you think you can study while the TV's on and you're answering your email and you're watching YouTube videos and listening to music, you would be much better off to spend less time studying but totally focusing on just studying and then do all that other stuff later, because only one thing can come into your mind at one time. So the last reason we pay attention, as I mentioned, is because of certain factors or certain objects, characteristics of the object. What are those? Well, there are many of them, and there are 11 exactly. So let me go ahead and mention what some of those are. The first one is contrast. Anything that is different from its environment stands out. The second one is proximity. Things that are physically close attract our attention as opposed to things that are far away. The third one is familiarity. Things that are familiar to us, close to us in our experience, draw our attention more than things that are different. The next one is suspense, and then humor. Now if you're saying, well, I'm going through these fast, well, on your lecture guide, you'll notice on the next page that I go into more detail here. The sixth one is conflict. The seventh one is novelty. The eighth one is activity or movement. The ninth one is concreteness. The 10th one is repetition. Things that are repeated get your attention until they reach a threshold. They can be repeated too much. And the last one is intensity. Some of these have more applicability to public speaking than others do. For example, intensity doesn't have very much, and suspense is a little bit hard to use in a speech, although it's not impossible. But on the next page of your lecture guide, I've given you sort of a breakdown of how you can use these particular factors of attention either in your visual aid, in your delivery, or in the content and presentation of your speech. So I'll let you read over those and see how they fit. But what I want you to keep in mind is that these are characteristics that you can put into elements of your speech that just naturally suck people in. They can't help it. For example, if you have animated figures on your PowerPoint slide, a little dancing leprechaun, it's very hard for the audience not to look at that. So you wouldn't want to keep the dancing leprechaun up there very long because it's going to keep attracting their attention whether they want it to or not. And that's the point. These will attract attention even against our will sometimes. So you want to use them, but use them sparingly and use them correctly. Finally, why is attention important? Well, attention relates to three parts of the speech. It first of all relates to the supporting evidence. You can see that a lot of the supporting material is going to pull from things such as familiarity or conflict or humor or contrast. The second is your visual aids. Your visual aids should attract attention. They shouldn't attract attention away from you in the speech. They should help. But one reason we use visual aids is to help people sort of become engaged and stay engaged with the speech. And the third is the introduction and conclusion, because as you remember, an introduction's first job is to suck people in, to engage them, to get their attention. So the factors of attention relate to those particular three areas of speech. Thank you.